All right, so are you ready to take a deep dive into Africa's economic future?
Always ready to dive in.
Perfect. Well, we've got quite a few Economist articles here from January 2025.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, they paint a picture of Africa's economic landscape that's pretty complex.
Uh-huh.
We're going to be talking about growth, we're going to be talking about challenges, and we're going to be talking about potential.
Exciting stuff.
It is a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is.
So let's just get started.
Sounds good.
Okay, so one of the big questions that we're going to try to answer today is Africa on the cusp of an economic boom,
Right.
or are they falling behind? And we're going to try to answer this by looking at the data,
Of course.
by looking at the challenges, but also by looking at some of the glimmers of hope that we found in these articles.
Interesting.
Yeah, so hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better understanding of what's really going on in Africa.
I'm really looking forward to that.
Great. So one of the things that really jumped out at me from these articles was this concept of what they call the Africa gap.
The Africa gap.
Yeah, and it's not just that growth is slow in some parts of Africa, but that the gap between Africa as a whole and other developing regions is actually widening.
Oh, wow. That's a very interesting
And the
concept.
projections are pretty stark.
Oh,
Yeah, if current trends continue by 2030, it's estimated that over 80% of the world's poorest people will be African.
80%. It's a huge number.
I know, it's a really staggering statistic, and I think it really kind of underscores the urgency of the situation.
Yeah, it really does make you wonder, what are the potential consequences of a statistic like that?
Well, poverty on that scale could fuel a whole host of other problems, not just in Africa itself,
Right.
but also globally. I
Mhm.
mean, we could see increased migration, political instability, and potentially even conflicts that could spill over borders.
Wow, that's a scary thought.
It is, and I think it really highlights how interconnected we all are.
Yeah, you're right. Sometimes we forget about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important to remember that this isn't just an African problem, It's something that could have ripple effects felt all around the world.
Mm-hmm. I see what you mean.
Okay, so let's dig into some of the factors that are contributing to this Africa gap.
Sounds good.
One thing that really stood out to me was the issue of productivity.
Okay.
The articles talk about this societal shift of people moving from rural to urban areas,
Right.
but it seems like it's happening without the kind of agricultural or industrial revolutions that we've seen in other parts of the world.
Ah, so they're kind of skipping steps.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to skip steps in the economic development playbook.
Interesting. What's holding them back?
Well, one of the biggest factors is a lack of essential infrastructure.
Like what?
Well, I mean, just imagine trying to launch a tech startup when nearly half the population of sub-Saharan Africa doesn't even have access to electricity,
Wow. Yeah, that would be tough.
and less than 4% of farmland is irrigated.
Really only 4%.
Yeah, so these are really fundamental building blocks that are simply missing.
Well, it's like they're trying to build a house without a foundation.
Exactly. You see countries like Brazil launching these huge fintech giants, and you see Indonesia with e-commerce going crazy, and then you look at Africa's corporate landscape, and it's like a desert.
Why is that?
Well, the article suggests that Africa might actually have too many small businesses.
Too many businesses. How is that even possible?
Well, I know it sounds counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you always hear about how entrepreneurship is a good thing.
It's supposed to be the engine of growth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when you have so many tiny informal businesses, it can actually hinder overall growth
I see.
because those large firms are essential drivers of productivity and economic progress.
So they're the ones that really drive growth.
Yeah, they bring resources, innovation, and efficiency to the table that a lot of small informal businesses just can't.
Okay, so it's about quality over quantity.
You got it.
Yeah.
But it's not just about having the right ingredients for economic growth. It's also about creating an environment where those ingredients can actually flourish.
The right condition?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
the articles point out this really tangled web between politics and business in many African nations.
Yeah, I've heard about that. What do they call it? Big man syndrome?
Yeah, that's one way to put it. It basically means that things like property rights, access to resources, even your basic safety as a business owner can depend on the whims of those in power.
Wow. So it's all about who you know.
Pretty much, and that creates a climate where playing by the rules isn't always the best path to success.
Yeah, it discourages long-term investments.
Exactly, and that's the kind of investment that you need for large firms to really thrive.
Right.
That
Yeah.
makes sense. So it's a pretty challenging environment.
Yeah, for sure.
But are there any bright spots, any signs of hope in all of this?
Well, I'm hoping you can tell me about that.
There are, yeah. I mean, for one, some countries are actually bucking the trend.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the article specifically mentioned Ivory Coast
Uh-huh.
and Rwanda as examples of nations with pretty solid economic growth. Interesting. So those are countries to watch then. What are they doing differently? I mean, what can we learn from their success?
Well, both countries have made significant strides in improving governance
Okay,
and creating a more business-friendly environment.
makes sense.
They've also invested in some key infrastructure projects,
Right.
and they've been focusing on diversifying their economies.
So basically, they're kind of doing everything right.
Yeah, it seems to be working for them at least.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. It shows that progress is possible.
Right, exactly.
And what about those regional initiatives that we were talking about earlier, like the African Continental Free Trade Area? Could that be a game changer?
It certainly has the potential. I mean, just imagine the possibilities if they can actually reduce trade barriers and create a more integrated market across the continent.
Yeah, that would be huge.
Right, it could unlock so much economic activity and opportunity.
It's a huge undertaking, though, and there are bound to be challenges along the way. I mean, just getting all those countries to agree on the details is a feat in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. But
Yeah.
the fact that they're even attempting something this ambitious is pretty exciting.
Yeah, it really shows a commitment to working together to solve these problems.
Hmm.
But I also wonder about the role of the West in all of this.
Yeah.
The articles touched on the question of foreign aid. Can that help to bridge the Africa gap?
It's a complex issue.
Hmm.
I think aid can play a role, but it's definitely not a silver bullet.
Right.
There's always that risk of creating dependency
Uh-huh.
or fueling corruption or simply not addressing those root causes of poverty.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem and hoping for the best.
Exactly.
What's the alternative then? What can developed nations do to really make a difference?
Well, the article suggests some pretty radical ideas, actually.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, imagine if Western governments actually got serious about dismantling tax havens that are draining African wealth.
That would be a huge shift.
Right. And what if they ease trade barriers, allowing African businesses to really compete on a level playing field?
So basically giving them a fair shot.
Exactly. Those are the kinds of structural changes that could really make a difference.
Yeah, instead of just putting a Band-Aid on the symptoms.
Right. It's about addressing the underlying challenges.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges.
Mhm.
We've talked about the potential.
Uh-huh.
We've talked about the role of aid and trade.
Right.
But is there like a wild card in all of this, something that could really shake things up and chart a new course for Africa's economic future?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think the answer comes down to leadership.
Leadership, tell me more.
Well, what if a new generation of African leaders emerged?
Okay.
Leaders who are really committed to good governance,
Mm-hmm.
to transparency, to creating an environment where businesses can thrive
Right.
independent of those political connections.
So you're talking about a real break from that big man model.
Exactly. A shift towards meritocracy where talent and innovation are the keys to success.
Yeah, not political favors. That's a powerful vision. I like it. But as we were reading these articles, there was this one specific story that really stuck with me.
Oh, which one?
It was the story of Indonesia's attempt to build a national car industry back in the 1990s.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. The Timor, right?
Yeah, the Timor, it was backed by political connections, subsidized to the hilt, and it totally flopped.
Yeah, it was a classic example of industrial policy gone wrong.
It makes you wonder if these top-down approaches can really work.
Right. Do you really need a more organic bottom-up approach
Yeah, where businesses can respond to market signals.
instead of political directives?
Exactly. And it got me thinking about the importance of timing.
Oh.
I mean, back in the 90s when Indonesia launched the Timor, the global auto industry was pretty stable.
Right.
But today, it's a completely different story.
Yeah, you've got this huge disruption with EVs.
Exactly. And you've got this resurgence of resource nationalism, protectionism.
It's a much more volatile environment.
Right. And that makes me wonder, is this actually the moment where Africa could leapfrog ahead? That's an interesting thought.
Could they capitalize on this global turmoil to forge their own path?
One that's less reliant on those traditional models of development.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe this is their chance to really shake things up.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, the articles highlight how a lot of the success stories in Africa actually involve these partnerships with players outside of the continent.
Oh, interesting. Like who?
Well, think about those Chinese mining giants that are pouring investment into Indonesia's nickel industry.
Right?
Could that kind of collaboration be the key for Africa, too?
It's an interesting parallel, but those partnerships can be complicated, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I mean, on the one hand, you've got this potential for rapid development, knowledge transfer, access to global markets.
Right.
But then on the other hand, there's always that risk of exploitation.
Yeah, you don't want to just become dependent on these outside actors.
Exactly.
Mm.
So how can African nations make sure that these partnerships are actually beneficial?
Right, and that they actually contribute to long-term sustainable growth. It all comes back to leadership, doesn't it?
It always does.
You need strong leaders who can navigate those complexities and make sure the deals benefit everyone.
Absolutely. And it also ties into that whole debate about resource nationalism
Right.
that we see playing out in places like Indonesia with nickel and Bolivia with lithium.
Right. Those governments really want to control and profit from their own resources.
Exactly. But it can be a risky strategy.
You so?
Well, if it's not managed carefully, resource nationalism can scare off investors and actually hinder economic growth.
So it's kind of a balancing act.
Yeah, you want to harness the value of your resources,
Uh-huh.
but you don't want to disrupt global markets,
Right.
and you don't want to scare away those investors that you need.
Okay, so it sounds like creating a stable and predictable investment environment is key.
Yeah, one that attracts foreign capital,
Mm-hmm.
but also makes sure that local communities benefit.
Right, so everyone wins.
That's the goal.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the Africa gap, the challenges of productivity and infrastructure, the complex relationship between politics and business, the potential of those regional initiatives, the role of foreign aid and investment.
Right. A lot to think about.
It is, but is there like one key takeaway that you would want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that Africa's economic future is not set in stone.
Right.
There are definitely challenges, but there's also incredible potential.
It's not a foregone conclusion.
Not at all. And I think it really comes down to the choices that African nations make.
The policies they implement, the partnerships they forge, the leaders they choose.
Exactly.
You know, speaking of choices, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay, sure.
We've talked a lot about these external factors like aid, investment, global trends.
Right.
But what about those internal dynamics?
Like a what?
What about the power of stories and culture?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, because the articles touched on this idea of the Africa gap becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So if everyone believes that Africa is destined to fall behind, then it will.
Exactly. But what if we challenge those assumptions?
What if we tell a different story?
Exactly. What if we start highlighting Africa's resilience, its entrepreneurial spirit, its incredible diversity and creativity?
That's a story I want to hear.
Right, a story that inspires a new generation of leaders and sparks a global movement to support Africa's rise.
I love it.
So to our listeners out there, I hope you'll continue to explore these stories, challenge these assumptions, and see the potential that exists within Africa.
Yeah, it's a continent full of possibilities.
And it's a story that's still being written and one that we can all play a part in shaping.
Absolutely well said.